Hi, and welcome back to Football Made Simple.
Football is a game of constant evolution. Trends and fashions are rethought, recycled, and at times redefined to shape the landscape of tactics for different teams, determining which player roles are vital and often how they're played. And no position has undergone more surgery in recent years than that of the fullback. In prior times, the fullback stayed deep to help prevent counterattacks. Then in the 90s and beyond, a good modern fullback was one who loved to overlap his winger and also had the engine to get back. So generally they operated in these large straight lines down the flanks and had minimal involvement on the ball. But in recent times, the inverted fullback, tucking in early to the center, has become more and more common. And now we have gone beyond just inverted fullbacks, and just like grouping all central midfielders together might be too broad strokes as there are so many different types, inverted fullbacks are also beginning to break down into clearer roles. So let's examine why inverted fullbacks are in vogue and why clumping the likes of Walker, Trent and Zinchenko into one bucket may be too simplistic. And a real-world example at how these different roles meant Pep, for example, couldn't plug and play by replacing Zinchenko with Cancelo and instead had to introduce Rico Lewis. In broad strokes, inverted fullbacks, rather than stay out wide, tend to invert into central regions of the pitch for advantages on and off the ball. On the ball, having extra men central means that they can first outnumber the opposition, making it easier to keep the ball in midfield regions. At the same time, the central midfielders now have more permission to move higher up the pitch earlier, as the inverted fullbacks can help to do the midfield progression instead. Off the ball, having this many numbers around the ball means that when the ball breaks, there is almost a net, making it likely to break to the opposition team and allowing them to maintain pressure on their opponents. At the same time, it also allows them to quickly surround the opposition to counter-press in the center due to having so many numbers. But now we get to the crux of the issue. The center of the pitch is a very large part of the pitch, to say the least, and to say that they just invert centrally might be too broad. And that brings us on to this type of inverted fullback tends to invert in the first phase and in deeper areas of the pitch, which means that usually from left back or right back, they will instead tuck in to become the third centre back. Compared to other types of inverted fullbacks, this one tends to be more limited on the ball and keeps things relatively simple when in possession by finding more talented players as well as allowing them to have numerical superiority in the first phase. Their role allows them to be more pertinent in the defensive phase as well, as by starting so deep they help to provide cover when the team is high up the pitch. As such, we see many hybrid players who naturally can both play centre-back and full-back occupying this sort of role, due to their natural intelligence when it comes to covering spaces. Extremely pacey defenders with good physicality also fit well into this archetype due to their ability to cover when they're counter-attacked. Prototypical players in this mold are Benjamin Pavard, Ben White and Kyle Walker. So what's the next type of inverted fullback? This is perhaps the type of fullback that instantly comes to mind when talking about inversion. In the first phase, they tend to move into positions more traditionally occupied by the defensive midfielder or the pivot. We have seen various iterations of this, either with two controlling fullbacks who allow the defensive midfielder to temporarily drop in to create a 3-2 structure in the first phase, or maintaining a 2-3 as well. Or if they are paired with a defensive inverted fullback, they will just invert alongside the pivot, now maintaining a 3-2 shape. These regions of the pitch tend to be difficult to operate in, as high-pressing teams especially look to shut down the pivot as much as they can, because the pivot or the pivots tend to dictate the play. So that means to play as this type of player, they have to be quite press resistant to avoid giving the ball away in crucial zones. This means a high technical ability is required, but also being able to operate in small spaces, using sharp passes, and general awareness of where the opposition is. But where the deeper fullback can be much more conservative with the ball, the controller often has to be more adventurous. Opposition teams will tend to occupy the natural pivot at all costs, as they tend to be much better on the ball, meaning that the fullback may be on it a lot more. So they have to be willing to carry the responsibility of breaking the lines and progressing the ball into players who have shifted higher up the pitch. On the defensive end of things, they tend to be quite solid, knowing when to back up the press, drop deeper, jockey centrally, or fall back into their starting fullback position. So prototypical players in this position in the mid-2010s would have been Lahm and Alaba, and more recently, Alexander Zinchenko. And the final type of inverted fullback is... So this archetype of inverted fullback and the controller tend to have a lot more overlap. In fact, these roles are often played by the same fullback depending on the team's tactics for a match, but not always. These fullbacks tend to move in centrally much higher up the pitch, into the half space, and are often combined with a dangerous winger who doesn't mind staying wider. Naturally, by being in this position, they tend to be players who are highly technically gifted with an ability to create several chances for their teammates. And a quirk is that their defensive ability may not always be the best. But from these positions, their main roles tend to be finding the more dangerous winger outside them, or whipping in dangerous crosses to the forwards. Two examples of this type of fullback are João Cancelo, as well as Trent Alexander-Arnold, who can both start as more of a controller, but also express their superior attacking qualities in the final third. So just how important are these roles? Like we said, there's a lot of overlap, but the case of Manchester City in 22-23 is a good illustrative example. When Zinchenko left, the general feeling was that he would be missed, but he had never fully solidified himself as the left back, and in prior seasons, City had been willing to sell him to the likes of Wolves. So when Arsenal stumped up what is now a bargain €35 million, it seemed an obvious plug and play, and perhaps even an upgrade, in having Cancelo now as the undisputed left back. After all, he had been in the PFA Team of the Year the 2 seasons prior. But there was a variety of factors that led to this not being the case, but we'll focus on a few. Firstly, Cancelo is capable of playing the controller role, but he naturally has a much more attacking instinct, where he moves higher into the half space and looks to create chances, often with a Trivela cross or cut in for the shot. But one problem is that with Walker being a more defensive fullback, at times City had to use the 3-1-6 formation in the build-up, which of course has benefits. However, even with Rodri's excellence, teams could still press City more. This would mean that City in general had less control, especially on the transition. At times, to compensate, one of the midfielders would have to drop deep alongside Rodri, meaning that they played with somewhat of a dedicated 4-2-3-1 early on in the season. With a dedicated forward in Haaland, once teams began to sit off of City more, we saw that there were times where Haaland could be isolated, not having enough midfield numbers around him to combine with, due to Silva or Gundogan being deeper. So what could Pep do? With Sergio Gomez out of favour, the only other players capable of playing left back were Ake and Laporte, but neither of these men would be technical enough to play the role of the controller. But either of them could play the role of a more defensive inverted fullback off the left hand side, tucking in to make a 3. But the problem was that Walker was not a particularly great controller who could tuck into the midfield region, allowing the midfielders to push higher. Enter Rico Lewis, who moved into the right back position, initially due to Walker's injuries, but soon kept him out of the limelight on merit. Lewis almost immediately adapted, performing his best Philipp Lahm impression, immediately inverting with Rodri and forming a great partnership, and bringing back a level of control in the midfield, and we once again saw a recommitment to having 2 false 8s from Pep. So, now the right back was the controller for City, with Ake or Laporte deeper, at least for a period, because Pep is always chopping things up. In fact, with Walker's return to the lineup, we saw Bernardo play as the left back on occasion, so that he could then invert and play the controller role, as with Lewis out, they still needed a more defensive inverted fullback, which was then retaken up by Kyle Walker. The role of the fullback is perhaps more important than it's ever been, and this is just one interpretation of the current state of them. But what do you think? What else have you noticed about them? Drop it down in the comments below.
I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, you might enjoy the content available on my Patreon. Not only does Patreon help to support the continued production of content, as I am a one-man team, but it also gives you early access to videos that will come on the channel. You'll also get exclusive videos, get to vote on polls, and so much more. And it's cheaper than ever, no longer having a tier system, so everyone on the Patreon gets access to all the content. So head over to patreon.com/footballmadesimple to check it out. But that's all for today, and remember, keep it simple.